I'm going to start. Perhaps I'll just talk a little bit about my intellectual interests. And I'm going to give you, in my kind of presentation, something of a tour of the horizon, a tour d'horizon, of thinking about the Atlantic, and particularly about the meanings of America, the issues that they raise, thinking about a transatlantic art history raises for us, particularly as art historians. So as Bela said, I work on British visual culture and imperialism during the long 18th century. And any of you who might be 18th century scholars will recognise it when I say that we are imperialists. So my version of the 18th century is actually 2 centuries. It starts in the mid-17th century and ends in the mid-19th century. In particular, I am interested in the ways in which the emergence and establishment of imperial power informed and transformed subjectivities. And with that, the types of political, intellectual, sensory, aesthetic, and life experiences which artworks might produce in the metropolis and in colonies, and which those works actually kind of can be seen to engage with, or to mitigate, or to elaborate upon. And so we're thinking about a kind of visual culture of an empire. I suppose it forces us to think about a transnational art history, and the possibilities of that. I think are complicated, not only by the prevalent forms of imperial extraction and encounter, which can be very material, but they can also be very imaginative. That is to say, they're full of myths and dreams and visions and nightmares. So we're talking about the real, with capital in capital letters, but we're also, I think, when we think about a transatlantic art history, particularly perhaps, thinking about a lot to do with desires and dreams and fantasies and, as I said, nightmares. So there's something going on in terms of the imaginary. There's something very clearly about the material. We've also got the power differentials that underwrite the cultural relations of empire to deal with, and that's not insignificant. And also, I think the very notion of the work of art as an analytical aesthetic category is really complicated by thinking about such a kind of art taking place within such an arena. And part of that is because in the period I work on, in the 18th century, it's very clear that the category of the work of art emerges in part through a distinction from the kinds of crafts and image-making practices of subject peoples. And so there is a kind of distinction going on there that is fundamental to the birth of a particular kind of aesthetic form and experience that we now think of as art. And so there's something, for us to question. So just to kind of recap then, thinking about a kind of transnational, transatlantic art history presents, several challenges. How do we read across cultures in a way that respects difference and yet remains attentive to the effects of power? To what extent does art history assume coherence, even stability in originating cultures? And do we need to think again, not only about the boundaries of art history as material repertoire, and I think this is very important when thinking about Atlantic during this period, but also about the practices and intentions of history itself. So there are big questions, I think, being raised by such a study. Right, that's the science bit over with. I'm going to start, get the kind of presentation really by giving you a quote that Christopher and I talked about on the phone, this Pete's diary. It's not about America, but it is, because it's actually about the kind of global system of which America had entered into. It's from the diary, it's the 16th of November, 1665. Pepys tells of how he had gone down the river to Erith, which is down going up towards the sea along the Thames, had met up with his colleague and his mistress, had a kind of good chinwag gossip about a friend of theirs who'd managed to get lots of jewels from a kind of captured Dutch ship. And then they take him to go onto a ship. This is a Dutch East Indies ship which had been captured and brought into the Thames. And I'll quote the lines because it does quite a lot of work for me in thinking about the kinds of experiences and images that inner and outer that imperialism can produce. So they carried me down into the hold of the India ship, and there did show me the greatest wealth lying in confusion that a man can see in the world. Pepper scattered through every chink, you trod upon it, and in cloves and nutmegs I walked above the knees, whole rooms full, and silk in bales and boxes of copperplate, one of which I saw opened. Having seen this, which was as noble a sight as ever I saw in my life, I away on board the other ship in despair. So that kind of scenario that Pepys, in really evocative terms, I think, conjures for us, is one in which matter and experience come together, and it's the imperial system that has produced that. The Dutch East Indies ship, which is full of the kind of wealth, as it were, that could be acquired in the East Indies, but within a system which was absolutely involving America at this time. And so much of what Pepys kind of recounts of that experience, one can presume and see was also the case for perceptions of America. I'm starting just with this slide here of, this is the first ship to be built for the Royal Navy in America, a model of it dating from 1749. The ship was built just a couple of years earlier. It was a gift, this commission from the British government to the people of New England. The shipwrights were given a nice bit of work, basically, to do to build this ship, the America. And I'm using it really just as a kind of example of the way in which technology is very important to, or technologies are very important to thinking about transatlantic culture. In this case, the material technologies of shipping, the timber, all of the requirements of the machinery of the ship, the rope systems, all of the kind of fixtures and fittings. This is quite a small ship, I think it was about 42 guns, something like that. Absolutely of the type, the right kind of ship that was excellent for policing the eastern seaboard, including Manhattan Harbour. It's the technologies of crewing it, human technologies of feeding, watering, treating, i.e. kind of looking after, organising, disciplining the workforce that made the ship and then the workforce that worked on it. So there are all sorts of technologies just at stake within this, and obviously then you might think about the technology of building the model itself. We also, if we're thinking about transatlantic culture, visual and material, need to think about issues about credit, debt and insurance. So the financial technologies that were absolutely essential to the possibility of transatlantic trade and power. And the ways in which those produced clearly or entailed human costs and implications are extraordinary. If we're thinking about the slave trade, but particularly the financial mechanisms that were absolutely required for the running of the slave trade. There is no way that that trade could have proliferated in anything like the way it did without systems of credit and debt. And those systems implicated many, many people on both sides of the Atlantic. So this artist, Joseph Wright of Derby, I know had slave bills going through his accounts, through his account books, basically, and he was just absolutely typical of our people who lived kind of within range of Liverpool in having such money run in his pockets. But he was part of a community of artists who were critically engaged with the costs of that economy. Might be suggested by this picture, which I think is an extraordinary kind of allegory and meditation, I suppose, on the kinds of greed and extraction that slavery and the attitudes involved and implied within slavery. This figure with this black girl here who is wearing cotton, striped cotton, which we can absolutely kind of identify as being characteristic of American exported cotton. There is, you probably can't see it, but just behind her shoulder on the left-hand side, a ship sailing off into the horizon. So there's a kind of narrative here that's very important. And there's something about that kind of urn that stands almost as a kind of fourth figure within this trio of girls. Two girls and their black servant. That was the one of the titles that was given to this work. This urn, which is like a swollen, kind of demanding presence, like a deity, basically, that it has to be fed with the goods, the profits, something. In their midst. So there's some meditation here, I think, about the transatlantic trade economy and its implications. We've also got, here a reflection on matter. We've got a clear sense that the transatlantic, was part of a kind of reconception of the world, which involved practices of knowledge. Just as an example here of a still life produced by a Dutch artist who worked in London, which includes, you might just see kind of a publication which is a description of the world, and that America forms part of, as it were, the kind of four corners of the world. It's something you must know about. So there's a kind of urgency that's implied intellectually and in terms of content by that sense of the world as needing to be known and understood. America, in particular, it's significant, I think, for European audiences, including English audiences in the 17th century, running through into the 18th century, represented nature writ large, in good and bad ways. Here, Francis Barlow's image shows us an America which is Edenic, basically, one in which the creatures of the world exist alongside each other in proliferation, but also in some kind of state of harmony. Without man's, I don't think there's any figures of human intervention here. It's an entirely natural kind of pre-human landscape. We don't need to look far for images of American, kind of natural Americans, Native Americans, and a kind of fascination that occurs within British art in those figures. Again, as kind of Adam and Eve type, types, basically, through which the relationship between man and nature can be interrogated and made mythic. In an image such as this, West's an Indian family, we're looking at clearly a kind of citation of the Apollo Belvedere and all of that involves in terms of attributions of virtue and heroic kind of warrior status, and that's an important thing about war and conflict, how much that is central to conceptions of America. But there's also here something about narratives. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting about thinking about the transatlantic, is that there is a strong emphasis upon narrative possibilities here in a way that opens up new possibilities for narrative, new kinds of meanings, new stories can be told because of transatlantic connections and travel. In particular, perhaps new types of violence can be envisaged. And there is a strong emphasis upon competition and contest in perceptions of America, which no doubt come out of certain kinds of realities. And if we look at, for example, the character of New York as a state and as a city, it's extraordinary how very diverse it is and how competitive it is within its social groupings. The image that I'm showing you here on the left-hand side, Benjamin West's image of General Johnson, has as its central heroic figure an important individual in that story for New York State, William Johnson, who was, as any of you who kind of read about some colonial history from this period will know, a really pivotal figure in the British control and management of New York. He was, well, he's a really kind of complicated individual who, on the one hand, works very closely with, in fact, lives with and marries, I think, Native American groups, particularly the Iroquois. He's an important intermediary figure. He speaks Indian languages and has an extraordinary kind of ability to negotiate on behalf of the British. And yet he's also a major slave owner. So he's a difficult figure for us in a way to compute, because he seems on the one hand to be very liberal and then on the other to be a kind of somebody we would actually castigate. So there's a challenge there, but he's nevertheless somebody who is really interesting and shown here as civilization itself, I suppose, intervening, or certainly very British kind of notion of civilization, intervening between the savage figure of the Native American who reaches forward to scalp the puny kind of, I think this might be Swiss or Austrian figure, but basically kind of French figure of the officer who is about to become his victim, but will not be. It's interesting that the figure of Johnson is pointing the Native American warrior back to where he came from, back into the woods. So there's a kind of strong emphasis upon narrative trajectories there. The Van der Linde, I think, is significant too, thinking again about competition, contest, not just because of what it depicts, and there is something interesting, I think, about this obsession with scalping, the particular terror that it implies for European subjects, but also because of Van der Linde's own resistance to British modes of painting and his embrace of French manner. So there's something, I mean, actually within the aesthetic means of this work, which speaks to the subject, I suppose, of contest and competition, as well as, obviously within its content. Just to carry on thinking about human stories, one of the things that's very striking to me in looking at British responses to or perceptions of America from the point of about 1770 onwards is how much profound feeling enters into that relationship, and particularly an emphasis upon melancholy and loss, obviously, and absence, and the kinds of feelings, the interiority that produces. Here on the left-hand side, Gainsborough's extraordinary portrait of an officer from this regiment. I'll just look at my notes here. A regiment which was one of the first to be sent out, I think, to North America, and was fought in Boston. Particularly heavy fighting in New York. They fought, this is the 4th Regiment, they fought in the Battle of Brooklyn, in Harlem, an extraordinary kind of succession of heavy battles that they were involved in, with many, many casualties in this particular regiment during the just 1774 to 75. So this portrait of a young man who, appears to us in the uniform of that regiment, shown with this enormous kind of storm cloud behind him, with his kind of rueful-looking dog, leaning against this rock with a kind of expression of disconsolate kind of melancholy in his face. I think is really interesting, and it ties in with a contemporary interest, particularly exemplified by Mortimer, in a kind of Gothic elaboration of masculinities in which warriors are paid price of their trade, as it were, through these kinds of images of death and depression. It's part of a kind of Gothic visual culture, I suppose. Thinking about these kinds of narratives, we've also got the whole issue of money and exchange, and the ways in which matter can be given meaning very quickly in the colonies, in which exchange is immediate and can be, stories can be kind of fabricated around it. In an example of Benjamin West's image here of Penn's treaty with the Indians, in which the cloth is almost like a kind of blinding white revelation that is passed over to the Native Americans. In awe, they are shown. I mean, its blankness is interesting in terms of thinking about the kinds of exchange that were actually going on here around land, how the Native Americans were actually essentially being forced to give over their land to settlers, and being given very little, if nothing, in return, and without much in the way of kind of paperwork or contracts. Actually, that's characteristic, I think, of the way the British worked in America, is they did not use paperwork very much. The Dutch did, but the British tended to go by words, basically spoken words. And there's something here, I think, about that kind of material, textual exchange, but it's not really much in the way of text itself. Finally, just to come to the end of this bit, thinking about the movement of bodies, it's obviously we've got this issue of the slave trade, but we also have an important history of transatlantic delegations. Just showing you here an example, an early example of that, depicted. It was originally 5 representatives of, I think, the 6 Nations and the kind of Mohawks, and then one Mohican, who were taken to London by the Mayor of Albany in 1710. I mean, really to try and persuade the British government to help him fight the French off. So there's something interesting here, but what happens to them is that they find their way into representation here, numerous forms of representation, lots of portraits of them. There's a great deal of fascination with them as kings in particular, and again that interest in the natural kind of humanity and human qualities of these individuals, and particularly their status as royal. There's an interest here in drawing obviously on the tradition of royal portraiture in their depiction. And it seems that elements of the material kind of existence of these men found their way into British collections. The British Museum has a number of objects, I'll just run through them quickly here, which seem to be belonged to these men, and which, are by way of curiosities, collected by Hans Sloane and entered the collection without much, it would seem, in the way of clear sense of their meaning, but really it's the material quality of them that matters. And it's that material, I'm just kind of going towards the end now, I'm going to turn now actually to talk a little bit about New York. That material quality of New York, that, and I'm talking here about the state and the city that is paramount, I think, in perceptions of it, the material possibilities of it. First of all, it's particularly beavers that we have to think about with New York, and I think there's something really interesting about beavers here. It's repeatedly the possibilities of beaver trade, until I think about the 1730s, something like that, it's a really substantial element of trade through New York State and through New York City. And the image of the beaver is important, I think, in understanding the way in which New York might be understood as a kind of natural landscape, which could be farmed, as here, by these, I mean, extraordinarily kind of well-organised beavers, who you can just see like a kind of regimented workforce, stripping their landscape in order to make their own empire, basically. So they're a kind of model, really, of colonialism itself. They are, they know what to do and they're getting on with it, basically. There's a kind of ecology, here that's important. And if we wanted to pursue this, but then we might think about the kind of way in which beavers then get consumed. So that would be a kind of transatlantic study, in a way, is to think about, the way, the trajectory, as it were, of the beaver from its home and its significance there through trade to its consumption, and the kinds of subjectivity that then are produced through beaver pelts. Now, I don't know whether these are beaver pelts, actually, but I suspect they may not be. But it's more than beavers. There's lots of fur that goes through New York. And the kinds of subjectivity that get produced through fur in fashion, beaver hat is a really important kind of garment for 17th century women to wear. And you can just see here, obviously I'm showing you these hollow images, these very kinds of sexual, eroticized experiences that fur could articulate, very tactile and sensory sensual kinds of experience that fur in a way kind of facilitates. So that's one thing to think about is the beaver. Another thing I want to suggest to you is the extent to which hinterland is important. It's not just New York City, it's the hinterland, and the two have to be understood, I think, in tandem, as paired. Otium et negotium. Business in the city, otium, retirement in the New York State. And they are two paradigms which really function together. So this image I want to suggest to you, or we might perhaps think about this, lone cabin with a lone person out in the wilderness, I don't know, somewhere on the Adirondacks, I'm not quite sure where, somewhere in New York State. And images like this, which are much more policy-driven. This is Thomas Pownall, who was a governor, whose images, these are made in views that he made in America, which then get engraved in and distributed from London, which show the Hudson River as this space which is basically there for exploration and possession. And then finally, so we've got otium here, nature, leisure, pleasure, and forms of retirement which then might be expanded upon and inhabited by colonial subjects. And then finally, negotium, that issue of this business of the city, of the kind of delirium that it might produce, which was really a common perception of New York City itself in the 18th century British texts, is that there is a sense that New York is truly, frighteningly kind of diverse. It doesn't have religion to contain it. It doesn't have, it seems, a clear moral kind of character. It's not like Philadelphia. It's not like Boston. It is extraordinarily kind of fragmented and fractious. And the kinds of perceptions of trade that are going on there are always about contest and competition. It is highly litigious and known to be so, and so there's something interesting about British perceptions, which then if we look at the earliest kinds of representations of the city's business, we get that kind of same perhaps feeling, as in an image like this, of that kind of crazed and frenetic kinds of energy, which the architecture of the city perhaps cannot contain. On the left-hand side, what we're looking at is the Tontine Coffee House, which is the first kind of established site for stockbroking in New York. On the right, a view down Wall Street towards the East River. So this is the very site which is still now the centre of the New York's financial district, and shown here by Francis Guy, by this American painter, as a place of rather kind of inchoate and frenetic kinds of energy, which contrast perhaps, and are not, as I said, not contained by the architecture, contrast perhaps with the ordering qualities of established institutions in Europe for financial exchange, the two stock exchanges in Amsterdam and London, in which we see the eclectic kind of energetic society of trade ordered and given meaning by the architectural surroundings, quite different from the quality of New York. And on that point, I should hand over to Christopher.
We did discuss our presentations together a bit, transatlantically. I mean, the phone, but but not as much. But I was thrilled to find what I hope are points of contact between something to talk about, things which ranged not just to kind of representational commonalities in terms of thinking about paintings, but actual early modern conditions like, you know, sort of globalization and even things like coal. So, but I will step back on chronology and sort of look at that one particular place which we've just seen in a later state, and that's New Amsterdam. Now, before American New York, there was Dutch New Amsterdam, and before both, there was Manhattan. Now, building upon Sarah's comments, I want to, in what follows, offer 6 brief notes about grids, cities, fiction, and myth, which started in the early Atlantic, focusing upon the role of images in shaping and being shaped by New Amsterdam, which was founded by the Dutch in 1609 as a site and ideal, and in many ways, an experiment. Now, what's on the screen? Well, this is a pen and black ink drawing dated to about 1648. It's now in Vienna. It's about this big. It's relatively large for a drawing, 31.5 by 53 centimeters. And as the inscription, or the hovering inscription tells us, it says, quote, "The city of New Amsterdam laid out, gelegen, op the island of Manhattan in New Netherland," unquote. Word and image matter here as 2 different conveyors of information. It's before us, floating in blank space, and below it we see a thin strip of earth littered with houses on a kind of muddy bank. There's nets and a landing ramp. They mark the foreground, the front, a kind of washy blue shore. There's a lettered quay, which is on the lower left, not specific to this indication, but actually quite interesting in this milieu. It tells us what we look at. We see a fort, a church, a warehouse, a city hall, a gerecht, which means a place of justice, which in this case is the gallows, as well as this very, very interesting thing here that you see, which is I, which is simply, quote, "a flag which is hoisted upon the occasion of any ship entering the harbor," quote. It's a signal. And then, of course, at the end, a mill. Now, we're guided through the city by a list, which itself ambles down the page, peripatetically, just as we are encouraged to do visually. We have to tack our gaze between surface and image, between image and word, between feature and verbal translation, A through K. The image is at once a window and a plane, surface and view. The pairing of calligraphic texts, one a key, one a label, offers 2 different registers of horizontal information, seaborne information almost. Now, there's something more material to this. This actually shows Manhattan as viewed from Kaapstad Rock, which is right off and sort of what is now the Long Island side of Manhattan. Just to get you oriented here, Hudson River's on the left, what they call the North River, and East River's on your right. Now, the sheet, of course, formally looks back to the sky-dominated little landscapes that were familiar in the Dutch Republic. The little yawning panels of Jan de Goyen here, or even the trembling monochromatic etchings of Rembrandt on the outside of Amsterdam, looking in. Now, just some quick background. Manhattan Island was originally home to many tribes, among the Mohawk and Mohicans and the Algonquins. It was officially organized as a colony by the Dutch West India Company in 1635. It was meant to sustain itself as an entrepot for beaver and otter furs, and it was supposed to be the capital of the province of New Netherland. The Dutch West India Company oversaw it until 1664, when, of course, it famously went to the English, where it became New York. New Amsterdam was, as Sarah's beautifully alluded to, very different from other New World settlements, say in Massachusetts or Virginia, settled by the English. Unlike other experiments in North America, it made no pretense being something like a religious refuge or even farming colony. New Amsterdam was a node in a commercial web, a would-be pivot for a greater mercantile world. By 1623, sources tell us it had a sawmill, the beginnings of a church, and not much else. Now the sheet shows us New York long before the grid, before the airplane. It's an agrarian landscape spotted with houses and churches, viewed as if approached by a ship. Far from a Stadt, as it says here, this is a small village, almost in a state of suspension. We know at the time less than 1,500 residents were there. Many of them were infants, actually. Time has, of course, faded the pigments of the drawing now, and even the original sketchiness actually has been somewhat occluded. But the contours, even today, convey a sense of the precarious. The drawing has, of course, in this sense, proved irresistible to many popular historians, writing prehistories of the United States economy. And what is this drawing for, note 2, and who made it? We'll turn to that in a moment. The drawing's production has been connected with Dutch Manhattan's corporate overseer, the WIC. Now, the majority of people who actually voluntarily lived in Manhattan were employees. Technically, they were not citizens. They were employees of the company. And most, as today in New York, were transient. Many came from Dutch colonies like Curacao in the Caribbean, and after 1654, Brazil, which the Dutch lost that year to the Portuguese. The roles indicate people were English, French, German, Scandinavian, and Irish. They're all listed as such in documents. They were all not necessarily harmoniously cohabiting. Now, while slavery was illegal back in the Dutch Republic, it was permitted here, as this print shows in the background, as it actually would be in New York. There was something different. Slaves, however, in New Amsterdam could own land and could testify in court. That was unique in the New World. Still, this is, in theory, an island that we see, which is a privately overseen place of capital, transit, and labor. New York was a place for movement rather than production of goods. Now, form. The physical plan for all of this was supposed to be a fortified grid, which we know today. We know that because the WIC actually sent letters with the settlers over in 1623, many of which actually have been recorded. What we know is that the settlers brought a paper plan for the city itself. This document has long been lost, but records indicate it imagined the settlement as a kind of pentagonal fort, based upon, quote, a concept. Such an ideal with straight streets and lines of houses is suggested by this watercolor, which we know was distributed and copied back in the Dutch Republic in an attempt to lure settlers. Here, the tip of Manhattan and the border on the right, Wall Street, which they show, you can see these kind of raveled and crenellated bits at the right, is shown. The tip of Manhattan is secured by an intact fortress, you see, on the right with this now battery. There's gardens, orchards, and even a tiny framed grid of lanes. You can all see how these all have, just like Holland, they have gardens in the back. Now, we even know that an engineer, an architect, kind of engineer who was trained in Italian fortification, one Klein Friedrichs, was actually sent over to America to direct. This didn't happen in other colonies. And he may have been a pupil of the Dutch polymath, Simon Stephen, whose scary ideal city you see here, despite the crenellated and walls, may have proved inspiration for the plan. Now, like that plan, the whole settlement of New Amsterdam was meant to resemble nothing so much as a tidy and organized medieval European study. Now, this concept, of course, was drawn up in Amsterdam, and the Heffengracht, actually. It's by financiers, of course, who had never left the Netherlands. And we know that similar plans like this were aimed and implemented in other Dutch trading posts in Ghana, Bengal, and here, Batavia, from 1667. Indeed, the idea of exporting a specific urban form as a condition maybe of even social reform was not new, but New Amsterdam offered challenges. The medium of presentation mattered. In the 17th century Dutch Republic, as Veerle mentioned, The population was highly literate, disproportionately urban, and relatively media savvy. Most European economies, up to 95% of the economy, was still dependent upon agriculture. Not so in the Dutch Republic, which it was a number close to 65 or 80, a small country to be sure. Thus, unlike, say, English colonial propaganda from the same moment, which Sarah nicely showed, Dutch promotional literature from Amsterdam brandished America's similarity rather than its exoticism, if you think of that a lot, to Amsterdam, who you see in the right in the 16th century painting. Manhattan, that is, was not just safe and fruitful, but familiar. The fruitful pancake flat terrain, the Calvinist situation, it was brimming with commodities and mollified natives. New Amsterdam, as, and again, the earlier engravings actually showed, anchored a promising realm shared by colonists and natives. It was personified here in the actual images, which you see like this throughout the whole history. Now, seeds in these plans were laid conceptually for the plotting of Manhattan's famous grid, which would be executed only in the 19th century, a grid of 14 avenues and 280 plus streets. The 20th century Dutch architect Ron Koolhaas ironically eulogized Manhattan's own grid with his, quote, retroactive manifesto of 1778, Delirious, New York. And he actually invoked the 17th century to do so. Once, quote, kidnapped from its context and transplanted to a mythical island, the original Dutch plan was, quote, reassembled into an unrecognizable yet ultimately accurate new whole. This, said Koolhaas, is a utopian Europe, the product of compression and density. So, note 3. Compression and density. Visual conditions in our own centuries transplanted from old world avant-gardes to the new, often centered in Manhattan-born art and art history. The grid, as that ingenious New Yorker Rosalind Krauss has famously written, is both form and epistemology. It is symptomatic of modernity as a form. The grid is an order, but not one produced necessarily by science or reason. It's different from Renaissance webs of perspective in that it does not, as Krauss writes, always engage with the scene. If anything, the grid often masks or attempts to mask. And this dream of confidence in abstract projection, as with both Piet Mondrian's 1942 New York City, over in Pompidou, or early notions of Manhattan's blocks and avenues, the grid always cohabits with the messy space of the actual. Its aspiration is to offer, as the historian Tutsian has just said, an opponent of mental and visual disorientation. And this offering of the grid is, of course, consciously utopian, in the sense of using the future to think about the now. But to go back to the early modern, the grid itself was, of course, a vital representational matrix for Atlantic exploration itself, in very literal ways. The Mercator Projection, which was invented by an Antwerp cartographer in 1569, allowed for grids and allowed for the systematic connection of navigational points through a grid, but at the cost of accurate scale. Maps of the Atlantic, the Sustanian median for New Amsterdam, used the grid as a way to make sense of an uninhabited void between continents, the coordinated wilds of colonies and settlements. Mercator, however, admitted in his own explanation of the graphic tool, and as Mondrian, Koolhaas, and Krauss well knew, the grid is not an order, but it also is abstract. Excuse me, the grid is an order, but it is also abstract. Number 4. Now again, New Amsterdam was financially dependent not just upon the trade in goods and people, but upon worldly abstractions, loans, futures, debts, shares, risks. So too is it dependent, like no polity ever before in the New World, upon a very physical web, a grid, if you will, of correspondence, not just of people, not just of money, but of information, as today, and more materially, letters. Now, like England and the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic maintained a fairly extensive postal system beginning in the late 16th century. This relied on barges, messengers, and horses. And at one point, letters of course could get from Antwerp to Rome at the breakneck speed of 18 days. Now by 1600, however, correspondence had exploded and crossed the ocean in volume, type, and reach. In North America, courier service to and from Boston every single month existed, and even packet boats for mail-ply routes between Holland, Spain, Portugal, and the West Indies. It's of course from a letter, one carried by such a service, that the most foundational myth of Manhattan developed. Of course, it's a letter from a merchant named Anglia here, delivered to The Hague on November 1629, that Manhattan's famous acquisition by the Dutch, quote, from the Indians for the value of 60 guilders, end quote, was announced. But it was announced, as people often forget, at the very end of a letter, mixed in with this, which is a list of the prices acquired for pelts of otters and beavers. Such letters, of course, did not always arrive. The Atlantic was vast. It took about 6 weeks for missives to get from America to Amsterdam, if at all, and in general, much longer. Opportunities for paper missives to be lost on the grid, or to be misdelivered, to be damaged, to be delayed, was a matter of course in European postal systems. But it expanded in scale greatly when any sort of ocean was involved. We know that Dutch letters, which were fragile at the best of times, would often be sent in multiple copies by multiple routes, since so often the mail upon single ones could not be trusted. We actually have a wonderful letter from 1652 from New Amsterdam back to Amsterdam, in which New Amsterdammers themselves, actually speaking not far from the house in which Sarah invoked, are, quote, giving their letters to this or that sailor or free merchant, but the letters are often lost through neglect, remaining forgotten, quote. And then there's this report from a Manhattan-bound merchant who was forced to explain himself to impatient bosses back in Amsterdam in 1648. Quote, your honors will please realize that here it is not like France or other places to which mail carriers go every week. It will take a whole year before we get further tidings, in which time will hang very heavy on our hands, end quote. Now, early New Amsterdam depended, as New York still depends, upon accelerated access to news, to information, on knowing something before other people did. Correspondence's breakdowns were the sources of great anxiety. You read this throughout letters from the time. Quote, I'm longing very much to hear from you in such a far and distant land, wrote one Jan van Rensselaer from New Amsterdam in 1654. As much as an expanded culture of writing and reading in the Dutch Atlantic bespoke a kind of domestic opening of the world, it also fomented new conditions, epistolary conditions, of anticipation, uncertainty, slowness, delay, disappointment, and above all, loss. Now, transatlantic American art, as Jennifer Roberts has shown, and Sarah's has just pointed to as well, could often be characterized by the vicissitudes of these transit conditions. Jennifer Roberts has spoken about this beautifully. Now, in our Googleized moment, we often forget how concrete the vastness of the ocean separating home from colony would have felt, and how material the process of communication, of actual writing was. Quote, it is so cold here, end quote, wrote one Jannik Melayen from Manhattan in 1651, quote, that the ink freezes in the pen, end quote. A statement on cold, a statement on climate, yes, but also a statement on the immediacy of the epistolary experience. So many letters from this time, so many letters from New Amsterdam back home are overtly self-conscious about their own precariousness, both as paper letters and as bits of information. Dilated grids of time, as well as space, moments of waiting and expecting, were basic facets of epistolary existence in the Dutch Atlantic. Note 5. Troublesome sendings and receivings impacted the messy realities of New Amsterdam's own economy and its form. In the 1640s, the price of Dutch bonds like this had soared, and native traders had become dissatisfied with local tariffs placed on their goods. In 1649, according to one angry resident of New Amsterdam, the island was a mess. Quote, a place of complaint, distress, and poverty, where everyone was discontented and poor, end quote. Peter Stuyvesant, the famed city governor, actually complained in this letter how, quote, we've experienced the insolence of some of our inhabitants when drunk. They're quarreling, fighting, and hitting each other, even on the Lord's day of rest, of which we have ourselves witnessed. Competition, indeed. And the island had a crude reputation for illicitness and illegality. Unofficial taverns and prostitution flourished. Governance was corrupt. There was an architectural allegory for this ruin in that utopian fort I spoke of a minute ago. It was supposed to define the settlement, but by 1643, it was far from what it was supposed to be. Here's the report of a visiting priest that year. Quote, the fort under which we are to shelter ourselves, and from which it seems as if all authority proceeds, lies like a molehill on a tottering wall. Most of it has crumbled away, so that one can enter the fort on all sides. It has been declared that it should be repaired, but the people are too poor. Nothing is done." End quote. So by 1649, things had gotten so bad that New Amsterdamers sent a representative back to Holland by ship to complain to the States General, the ruling body of the Dutch Republic. This representative, one Adrian van der Donck, gave a presentation, an oral presentation to the magistrates. There, he laid out the indigent stage of the colony and also its potential. But he also, used props. This is in the listing. He used beaver pelts, tobacco, and native produce, such as squash and pumpkin, depending on the season. Now, it's actually been assumed that this famous Vienna drawing was overlaid on that presentation, was part of it itself, as some indication of the colony's dilapidated state. But as historian Elizabeth Sutton has recently shown, something even more interesting was the case with this. The drawing, in fact, was commissioned by the Dutch West India Company, the same people who were causing us the problems, not to obscure Amsterdam's troubles, but to lay some visual basis for their repair. This is testified to the fact that by 1652, this strikingly horizontal print was published directly after the sheet by the Amsterdam publisher Jan de Visser. It followed the Vienna drawing almost exactly, but differed in notable ways. It improved it, staffing it with busy residents, pictorially completing the stone fort. But in the print, architectural discipline was paired with social justice, recht. In this view, unlike the drawing, for example, the gallows is occupied, pointed to and discussed from the ground. Now, Visser's New Amsterdam portrait, printed back in Europe for a European audience, almost worked the same way, pointing and gesturing from afar. It's not just a motley collection of buildings, but an entrepot, in this case, teeming with people who are not always alive. It's a place that, as the key suggests, only becomes comprehensible almost by a visual back and forth, a correspondence, like a letter, between caption and key, the feature mechanics of in and out, of figure, of ground, of city, of hinterland, of living and dead. Note 6, final note. Now, the fort never actually looked like this. New Amsterdam was not alone, even among Dutch colonies, in having local conditions kill off some idealized concept. By the time the English took over in 1669, the fort had still not been completed. So if New Netherland could not be refashioned successfully and lastingly, it could in fact be represented according to formal conventions of the old. Such, of course, is the actions of the grid, even when no grid is present. It's an act, it's an aspiration, rather than a form. To print and describe Manhattan using formats developed in cartography is, of course, to assert claims of visual possession, to insist on an order without armies. And this insistence, as with any conceptual or literal grid, intrigues because at heart it is contradictory. Now, maybe in this, the Vienna watercolor is differently truthful about New Amsterdam as a visual idea. Its ambiguous fields of wash providing not just the effects of pictorial recession, of humid atmosphere, but of haze and almost visual indeterminacy. We apprehend the amorphous presence of land, but also maybe unseen correspondence and conditions. Conditions, of course, like work, but the grid idea omits and pretends. Conditions that remain deliriously unlabeled, uncaptioned. The sheet, that is, suggests what we don't know about Manhattan. Now, the drawing in the end remains indeed a touching snapshot of New York's earliest days as a self-assured city, an epic island at the center of the world. But it's also an image of an uncertain outpost, one tethered to economic and aesthetic grids of the globe by capital's wholly unpredictable strength.